On a warm afternoon in Rhode Island in the summer of 2003, a 50-year-old man flipped burgers on the grill while sipping a beer. He had moved to the area for a job a few years ago, but he still felt like the new guy at work. And so a midsummer barbecue was a perfect excuse to get the whole team together for some extracurricular bonding. As the sun set and the backyard full of people turned dark, he crouched down to plug in some lights strung along the deck. But as he bent over, he felt a sudden surge from his gut. He lurched to the edge of the lawn, fell to his knees, and heaved as stomach acid and half-digested food flowed up into his throat and spilled out of his mouth. The man's coworkers rushed over with napkins and water and helped prop him up against the railing. Once he was upright, his stomach gradually settled, and after the man got over his embarrassment, the party returned to normal. But the experience confused and disturbed him. He wasn't drunk. He hadn't been nauseous. It hadn't really even felt like he was vomiting exactly. It was like the contents of his stomach had just decided to exit his body, and he was powerless to stop it. In the summer of 1982, a corporate sales director named Roger Donovan walked up the steps of a suburban house in Detroit, Michigan, and knocked on the door. It was his 29th birthday, and one of his coworkers had insisted on throwing him a party. When the door swung open, nearly half his office was clustered inside, and they all shouted happy birthday and blew noisemakers. Roger had only been at the job for about a year, so he really appreciated the warm welcome, especially since lately he'd been feeling strange and kind of lousy. He'd developed a nasty wet cough, despite not being congested or sick. Some nights it got so bad he couldn't get to sleep, which left him feeling wrecked in the morning. He hoped it was just some weird seasonal allergy thing, so he was just trying to tough it out. So, for now, this party was a pleasant distraction. Roger had some drinks and snacks and caught up with a few coworkers he rarely got a chance to chat with. But towards the end, he found himself in the back patio near a group of people who were smoking. Although Roger himself had never been a smoker, being around smokers didn't usually bother him. But tonight, the smoke triggered his cough, and once it started, Roger couldn't stop. It got so intense that he felt embarrassed and decided to leave. But on the drive home, the cough stirred up this churning in his stomach. He could feel liquids sloshing around inside of him, and it made him feel queasy. Roger thought back to what he had eaten at the party, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, except for maybe a slice of birthday cake, which he didn't eat very often. And so he couldn't figure out why he was having so much gastric distress. Back at his house, where Roger lived alone, he turned on the TV and laid on the couch. He hoped being sedentary would help calm his stomach down. But only minutes after laying down, Roger began coughing heavily again and then felt a surge of nausea that immediately forced him to sit up straight. And as he was sitting there, he began sipping some water, and eventually he sort of calmed down and caught his breath, but he still felt rattled by what his body was doing. Crawling into his bed later that night, Roger wondered if maybe he had developed some new allergy to something, or if the coughing indicated a respiratory problem, like bronchitis. Either way, it worried him, because it was new, and because he had no idea what could be causing it. Clutching a pillow to his still churning stomach, he realized it was probably time to see a doctor. A few days later, Roger sat on the examination table in the office of a local pulmonologist, which is a doctor who specializes in the respiratory system. The doctor held a stethoscope to Roger's chest and asked him to take in a few deep breaths. After a minute of doing this, the doctor nodded, removed the stethoscope from his ears, and told Roger that his breathing sounded like he had asthma. Roger was surprised because he'd always lived a very active life and never had any breathing issues before. The doctor shrugged and explained that asthma can start at any age and can range from very mild to severe. He thought Roger most likely had what's called late-onset asthma, which is actually very common in adults. He prescribed Roger an inhaler and told him that using it frequently would make a big difference in his cough and breathing. He also advised Roger to see a gastroenterologist for any of his digestion issues. Roger took his advice and a few days later visited with a recommended local gastroenterologist named Dr. Ostrander. And after listening to Roger's organs and asking some questions about Roger's medical history, Dr. Ostrander concluded that Roger probably had acid reflux. This would explain Roger's nausea, his digestive pain, and his coughing. At first, Roger was skeptical of this diagnosis. He had never had digestion issues before, and he found it especially odd that it would set in at the same time as his late-onset asthma. Why would all of this just start now, out of the blue? Dr. Ostrander wasn't a lung specialist, so he wasn't really sure about if and how the asthma played a role in the acid reflux. But he said it's not usually connected to something like acid reflux. He explained that for most people, acid reflux is not something a person has their whole life. It comes and goes, depending on a variety of factors. Sometimes it's triggered by eating unusually rich foods, or lying down too soon after a big meal, or stress, or smoking cigarettes, or even certain medications can cause it. Dr. Ostrander explained that when food travels down the esophagus to the stomach, sometimes the sphincter muscle at the bottom of the esophagus relaxes at the wrong time, or it relaxes too much. That allows stomach acid to flow back up into the esophagus, which can cause heartburn, nausea, or stomach pain. And if the stomach acid sloshes high enough, it spills into the lungs, and that can block the airway. And so the doctor speculated that this could be the source of Roger's cough. Dr. Ostrander prescribed Roger some medication to help reduce his stomach acid production. But otherwise, he told Roger not to worry too much and just be aware of his diet in case there might be a particular food triggering all of his symptoms. A few months later, on a rainy autumn evening, Roger sat inside on his couch, feeling defeated. He had been using his inhaler diligently for months, but he hadn't noticed a difference. His cough was the same. And the meds had done nothing for his acid reflux. Even on nights when Roger went out of his way to eat an extra bland, simple dinner to avoid irritating his stomach, he'd still feel a surge of nausea as soon as he laid down. The Michigan weather didn't help either. Once summer ended and the temperature started to plummet, the chill of the air would sting Roger's lungs, particularly on early mornings before work. By the time full-on winter hit, Roger knew he'd basically have to stay indoors because outside, he'd struggle to breathe. Being cooped up inside so much only darkened Roger's already dark mood. But he hoped that eventually, somehow, his body would acclimate to whatever was going on, and he'd come out on the other side. In the meantime, he took another puff on his inhaler and laid back down on the couch. About 10 years later, Roger walked alone down a dark and silent suburban street late at night. The only sound was his footsteps echoing on the concrete and the occasional huff of his inhaler. Walks like these had become routine for Roger. Over the past decade, his cough and digestion problems had steadily worsened. Roger relocated to Augusta, Georgia for a new job last year, but that hadn't helped. It was a welcome change from breathing the frigid air of Midwestern winters, but even in the warmer southern climate, he often woke up with liquid in his lungs, causing him to cough until he vomited. These fits left him feeling delirious and nauseous, so he began taking late-night walks around the neighborhood just to settle his stomach. As Roger slowly shuffled along the empty streets, he felt depressed and disoriented. He'd recently turned 40, which he worried might be a health tipping point. What if his stomach issues and coughing only got worse with age? Roger took another puff on his inhaler and sighed. He didn't understand why all the doctors he had visited over the years had accomplished so little. At this point, Roger had been taking acid reflux medication and using his inhaler for a decade straight, yet his symptoms really had not improved in the slightest. And the lack of sleep as a result of these symptoms that were just not being curbed was really taking a toll on him and beginning to affect his performance at work. As Roger looped back towards home, letting his thoughts wander, he suddenly noticed an odd sensation in his chest, an unfamiliar pressure he'd never felt before. He stopped under a streetlight and ran a finger over his chest, trying to sense where this pressure was located. Roger took a slow, deep breath and abruptly stopped. There it was again. The moment air filled his lungs, he could sense it. There was this soft pressure at the base of his lungs. It was almost like there was an invisible hand inside of his abdomen, literally holding his lungs up. Roger shook his head, totally confused. I mean, who could actually feel their lungs? That's not a sensation you get. And so now, in addition to all these terrible symptoms he had had for years, Roger wondered if he was also starting to lose his mind. Another decade later, on a cold morning in the fall of 2003, Roger sat at the edge of an indoor swimming pool in suburban Rhode Island. His brain still felt blurry from yet another bad night's sleep, but he hoped a good swim would set him straight. After 8 years in Georgia and countless doctor's visits that led nowhere, Roger decided he needed a major change. He was approaching 50 years old and felt like he was in a bit of a rut, so he applied for and landed a job near Providence, Rhode Island as the vice president of a technology company. Roger was coming up on 3 years at this new job and had grown to love the team there. But unfortunately, his health problems had come with him. His cough had steadily worsened over the years, lasting longer and cutting deeper. The acid in his stomach sloshed around and went up into his esophagus anytime he wasn't actively standing upright. As a result, he had taken to sleeping on a mound of pillows to try to keep his body somewhat propped upright. It was not comfortable, but otherwise he'd be woken up by a sudden surge of vomit. In an effort to strengthen his breathing, Roger had found a local health club with an indoor pool and started swimming most mornings before work. It was the only activity Roger had discovered where his body could be horizontal and not trigger his symptoms. He didn't understand why, but he embraced it. Swimming had become, by far, the best part of his day. Once he was ready, Roger took a deep breath, dove into the water, and swam all the way to the other side. After a couple of warm-up laps, he tried testing how far he could swim while holding his breath underwater, surprising himself by making it 2 whole lengths of the pool. As he climbed out and toweled off, Roger felt energized. He also felt confident that whatever his health issues were, he did not have asthma. There is no way he'd be able to hold his breath so long and swim so vigorously if he did. It would also explain why the inhaler had never made a difference in 20 years. Roger was tempted to just throw the inhaler away. A couple weeks later, Roger hosted a barbecue party and suffered the worst flare-up of symptoms he'd ever had in over 20 years. While he was grilling burgers for his coworkers, Roger at some point had casually bent over to plug something in, and a torrent of half-digested food surged out of his mouth. There was so much stomach acid leaving his body that Roger fell to his knees, unable to breathe, and feeling this terrible burning sensation all along his esophagus. The experience was a wake-up call. Roger had to face the truth. His condition was not something he could just keep ignoring. It was only intensifying over time, and his body was starting to lose the fight against it. A week after the barbecue, Roger's colleagues stopped him in the hallways to ask how he was feeling. By now, word had spread. Everyone knew something was seriously wrong with Roger's health. But as much as he tried to act like it was no big deal, privately, Roger was starting to panic. He knew his life could not go on like this forever. He had been battered by the same digestive and respiratory symptoms for decades, and clearly they were not going anywhere. The thought of fighting this battle for decades more to come felt unbearable. But Roger did bear it without relief for 20 more years. And he did that by distracting himself by focusing on his career. After leaving Rhode Island in 2008, Roger had hopped around to a few different places before finally landing the biggest opportunity of his life in 2014. He was named the Chief Marketing Officer for a fabric manufacturer in Cleveland. On a spring morning in 2023, Roger strolled through the company's massive industrial warehouse to inspect a new delivery of fabrics all neatly stacked on pallets. Although he'd recently turned 70, Roger had no intentions of retiring anytime soon. However, the harsh chemicals used to clean the knitting machinery wreaked havoc on his lungs. Even before COVID hit, Roger had taken to wearing a mask in the warehouse to avoid exposing others to his coughing. Even so, his coughing fits only continued to get worse. Many days, Roger would be forced to make an excuse in order to hurry to his office, lock the door, and hack until he vomited into a trash can. Then he would wait until the entire office emptied out to dispose of the vomit in a toilet. And the nights after work were very lonely, because his condition made it impossible to socialize. Roger's digestive system was too fragile. He dreaded going to bed, knowing that his cough would inevitably wake him in a fit. The lack of sleep continued to add up, and he was older now and really felt his age, and so it wasn't as easy to bounce back in the mornings. Then came the breaking point. Later that week, in the middle of the night, Roger woke with his usual cough and stumbled to the refrigerator to fill a glass of cold water. But he couldn't make it. A sharp pang in his chest made his knees wobble, and he slumped onto the couch. Roger tried to take slow, deep breaths, but his lungs felt shrunken. The shortness of breath made him so dizzy, he worried he was about to pass out. Lying there motionless, waiting for his body to stabilize, it hit Roger with total clarity. It could not go on like this. It was no longer bearable. When his alarm went off later that morning, Roger called his primary care physician and booked the next available appointment. A couple days later, in the middle of the weekly staff meeting, Roger's cell phone vibrated with a voicemail from his doctor. Roger had been on edge, waiting to hear back about the results of a CT scan. At his appointment a few days ago, Roger's doctor had theorized that Roger might have chronic bronchitis. That would explain the wet, nagging cough. He proposed a CT scan to look for inflammation in the tubes connecting the windpipe to the lungs, which Roger agreed to. But the last 48 hours after the scan had dragged by as Roger's head swirled with worries. He hoped whatever news he got would finally put the years of uncertainty to rest. Apologizing for the interruption, Roger stepped into the hallway to return the call. And as soon as he heard his doctor's voice, he could tell something was very serious. The doctor spoke calmly and urged Roger not to worry until they knew more, but his CT scan had come back showing dark spots across his lungs. These could be one of many things, but among the possibilities, unfortunately, was cancer. Roger's heart sank. A part of him had always dreaded that his condition might be something truly terrible. Slipping the phone back into his pocket, Roger returned to the meeting. His coworkers carried on with business as usual, but Roger's mind was elsewhere, reeling at how everything in his life could have led to this. Dr. Gregory Crane had heard plenty of unusual medical histories over his many years as a pulmonologist in Cleveland. But the 70-year-old man sitting in his office was a rare case. Roger's story spanned so many different jobs and cities and major life changes, yet throughout them all, his symptoms had never improved. And then when Roger explained how he could actually feel his lungs, like there was a phantom hand inside of his body, Dr. Crane was riveted. Roger had been referred to Dr. Crane after receiving his CT scan results. Although it took multiple tests to prove it, Roger's doctor eventually determined that those dark spots on his scan were not cancerous. But despite this good news, Dr. Crane could plainly see that Roger was not a healthy man. His eyes were sunken and his skin looked gray from fatigue and the exhaustion of constant coughing. Ruling out cancer was a relief, but it didn't solve the much bigger question of what was causing Roger's condition. Dr. Crane's first thought was that Roger must have some unusual type of asthma. But Roger was quick to explain how previous doctors had diagnosed him similarly, yet 4 decades of using an inhaler had not helped at all. And so after running some additional tests, Dr. Crane told Roger something that no doctor had told him in 40 years. Roger's hunch was right. He definitely was not asthmatic. All those huffs on the inhaler had been for nothing. Roger sighed, shook his head, and then pulled out his inhaler and chucked it at the small trash can in the corner of the room. But he missed, and it hit the floor. When Roger stood up to pick up the inhaler, he suddenly began coughing violently. He quickly stood back upright, and the cough died down. But the sight of Roger bent over gave Dr. Crane an idea. He told Roger there was one more test he wanted to run. One morning the following week, Roger dragged himself out of bed after another ragged, sleepless night. His head felt tingly and hollow from being awoken every couple of hours in a fit of coughing. No matter how simply he streamlined his diet, or what angle he propped himself at to go to bed, his stomach still churned and his lungs still felt blocked. As an increasingly elderly man, Roger worried he would not be able to keep fighting this off much longer. Today, however, he felt more optimistic than usual. He had a special procedure planned with Dr. Crane that he actually had high hopes for. Roger showered, but then skipped coffee and breakfast because he was told not to eat or drink anything for 4 hours before this operation. At the hospital, Roger was led to a room where a technician was preparing a computer monitoring system. Roger felt a bit nervous, but more than that, he felt desperate. His body was beaten down by fatigue. This procedure seemed like his last chance. There was a knock at the door, and Dr. Crane entered, followed by a nurse carrying a kit of medical equipment. Dr. Crane told Roger to lay on the hospital bed and try to relax. Roger did his best, but flinched when Dr. Crane moved close, holding a thin, flexible catheter. Dr. Crane had warned Roger that this procedure would be uncomfortable, But even though Roger knew that, now that it was happening, it was hard not to be anxious. The first thing Dr. Crane did was he sprayed a numbing medication up Roger's nostrils and into the back of his throat. After that, he guided the tube up Roger's nose while the nurse handed Roger a cup of water to drink. With each swallow, Dr. Crane slid the catheter further and further down Roger's esophagus until it reached the entrance of his stomach. Roger almost gagged many times, but managed not to break into a coughing fit. Once the catheter was secure, Dr. Crane looped it over Roger's ear and connected it to a small computer about the size of a smartphone. Then he attached the computer to a belt, which Roger was to wear for the next 24 hours. Roger could eat and drink like normal, but he would need to keep a diary of his meals, activities, and symptoms. Meanwhile, the tip of the catheter inside of Roger would be recording the levels of acid in Roger's esophagus and transmitting them to the computer. The rest of Roger's day was bizarre. Doing anything with the catheter up your nose and down your throat was awkward. He had told his boss he was taking that day off for medical reasons, so he had plenty of time to kill. Roger went for a long walk in a nearby park, then bought some groceries, and made dinner for himself while watching TV. Nighttime felt long, strange, and uncomfortable. Roger's stomach was irritated by the tubing, and his breathing was as bad as ever. Lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling with a bulky belt around his waist strapped to a computer, Roger felt a little ridiculous. But he had run out of options in his life. And so at this point, even the smallest sliver of a chance that this procedure could help him was worth taking. And the next day, he found out it was definitely worth the risk. Dr. Crane had downloaded and studied the data from the computer, and the results were conclusive and shocking. The test that Dr. Crane had administered was called a 24-hour pH impedance test. By tracking the fluctuations in acid levels in Roger's esophagus across an entire day and night, he discovered something that no other doctor in 40 years ever had. Roger's esophagus was defective. He was missing a sphincter at the bottom of it. That meant there was no barrier between his esophagus and stomach like most people have. So there was nothing to stop the contents of his stomach from coming back up if his body was positioned at the wrong angle. And so night after night in bed, Roger's stomach fluids flowed up into his lungs. That's why he coughed so much at night and why walking around upright helped settle his stomach. Dr. Crane could not determine whether Roger was simply born without a sphincter in his esophagus or whether his sphincter had been damaged or destroyed over the years somehow. But regardless, the effect was the same. Roger's rare condition actually had a name. It was called non-erosive reflux disease. Roger was shocked as Dr. Crane explained his findings. All these years, he had imagined so many different outcomes, but this was never one of them. Dr. Crane referred Roger to a gastric surgeon colleague of his named Dr. Amanda Davenport to confirm his findings. But she soon discovered that a missing sphincter was not Roger's only medical curiosity. It would turn out the reason Roger could feel his lungs as if there was a phantom hand putting pressure at the bottom of his lungs was because his stomach had broken through the layer of muscle at the bottom of his lungs, called the diaphragm, and was actually pushed up against them. That meant the fluid in his stomach was directly next to his lungs. That pressure Roger felt came from the stomach fluids sloshing around because there was no sphincter to contain them. And so that was what he was feeling. Dr. Davenport was able to move Roger's stomach down, mend his diaphragm, and create a sphincter in his esophagus by using extra tissue from his stomach lining. And the operation was successful. And ever since, Roger's cough has vanished, and he can now bend and stoop and sleep in any position he wants without worrying. In the late summer of 2012, a 55-year-old man lay in a hospital bed surrounded by his loved ones. The man was at a skilled nursing facility, recovering from a bad fall that had nearly killed him. Thankfully, now he was on the mend and things were looking good. But today, as the man looked around at the familiar faces of the people gathered by his bed, his eyes suddenly filled with terror. None of them were supposed to be here. The man squeezed his eyes shut in fear, and when he opened them a few seconds later, he breathed a sigh of relief. The friends and family were gone, and he was alone. The man leaned back on his pillow and shook his head. He knew he was just seeing things. He had been alone all along.
But it was still disconcerting to have people pop in and out of his room like that. He did his best to relax and let it go, but then he caught a flash of movement in his peripheral vision, and his eyes went wide with fear once again. This time, it wasn't people appearing by his bedside. There was smoke coming through the walls, and the smoke was about to consume him. Popular diner in Waterbury, Connecticut, 52-year-old Gina Hale finished the last bites of her lasagna, being careful not to leave behind even a speck of the rich, delicious cheese. Across the table, her 55-year-old brother, Tony, downed his cheeseburger. This restaurant had been their hangout since they were kids, and whenever they came to this diner, where the old jukebox still had songs from the 1980s, it made them feel like they were teenagers again. From the moment they sat down on this July day in 2012, they were both wiping tears of laughter from their cheeks. Seeing Tony this happy made Gina smile. He'd been battling depression for a while now, and had finally gotten on the right antidepressants to help him feel like himself again. But as Gina watched Tony take a sip of his beer, she couldn't help but feel concerned. Now, with anybody else, a beer with lunch was no big deal, but Tony had abused alcohol for many years, and Gina couldn't hide her concern anymore. But Tony didn't even let Gina get a word out before he promised her this would be his last beer before he quit drinking cold turkey. Gina gave her brother a weak smile, trying hard not to remember all of his previous failed attempts at getting sober, which included 4 attempts at an actual rehab facility. She hoped this time it would stick, because all the drinking had really taken its toll on her brother. A little while later, when they got up to leave, Gina noticed that her brother was a bit slower than usual as he inched his way out of the booth. Out in the parking lot, Gina gave Tony a big hug as he hopped on his Harley and promised her he was okay to ride. He had the same brown eyes as their mother, and for a split second, it was like their mother's face flashed in front of Gina's eyes. Their mother had been an alcoholic too, and she eventually had died of cancer. And so as Gina watched her brother ride off down the street, she hoped he was not following in his mother's footsteps. Three weeks later, Gina broke a pane of glass at the back of her brother's house, then pried open the window and climbed inside. Gina hadn't heard from Tony in a few days. After their lunch they had together, he'd quit drinking cold turkey just as he'd promised. But it had not gone well. He'd been overcome by a condition called delirium tremens, which is when the body starts to shut down from alcohol withdrawal. Tony had been forced to spend an entire week in the hospital to recover, but he'd gotten through the worst of it, and Gina had hoped that this time he'd be able to stay sober. But now, it was clear something was wrong. Gina didn't know if Tony had gone into withdrawal again or maybe fallen off the wagon. But either way, he never just went radio silent like this. And now, looking around at the inside of his house, Gina knew it was bad. She crept through the rooms, calling her brother's name over and over, but there was no response. The unventilated house felt like an oven. As she wiped the sweat from her face, she looked at the dirty dishes and the overflowing garbage in the kitchen. She hadn't heard from Tony in days, and now, finding his home in this condition, she just couldn't stop the panic rising in her chest. Just then, a yellow streak flashed past her and she jumped. Her brother's tabby cat was suddenly at her feet, brushing up against her legs and yowling for attention. Gina could see that the cat's food dish was empty, and so she wondered why Tony hadn't fed his cat. As Gina was about to feed the cat just took off running down the hall and disappeared through the open door to the basement. Gina followed the cat down the hall, she turned to go down the stairs, she flipped on the basement light, and immediately she stopped. That's when she found her brother. Tony lay crumpled in a motionless heap down on the basement floor. Gina ran down the stairs to his side, and she could immediately tell he was badly hurt. His hair was matted with blood, his skin was a yellowish gray, and he had dark bruises all over his legs. Tony looked like he'd been lying there for a while, maybe even days. Gina pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. After she described what was going on, the dispatcher asked if Tony was breathing. Gina shakily replied that she couldn't tell. But just then, Tony's mouth opened and he began to cough. And as he gasped for air, his cracked, dry lips tried to form words. Gina begged the dispatcher to send help right away. After hanging up with the dispatcher, Gina took her brother's hand and leaned in close to hear what he was trying to say. But she couldn't make it out. He was just babbling something. And soon, his mysterious whispers were drowned out by the sounds of the ambulance pulling into the driveway. 3 hours later, Gina sat down in the only seat left in the crowded ER waiting room, a tiny plastic chair in the kids' play area. As she sat there, she ate a bag of chips from the vending machine, wishing she had something more filling to eat. But mostly, she just couldn't stop thinking about the sight of her brother at the bottom of the basement stairs, his body twisted from the long fall. She really had thought Tony was dead, and she felt so grateful that he had a pulse when the EMTs finally reached him. Gina shifted uncomfortably in her chair for a few more minutes, until the waiting room door swung open and a doctor finally called her name. Gina raced up to him, bracing for the worst. Tony was still alive, the doctor explained, but barely after his fall down the stairs. Tony had a severe concussion that may have damaged his brain, and he had suffered so much damage to his muscles in the fall that his kidneys had shut down. The doctor said he very likely would need dialysis, which is a process in which machines remove waste from the body when kidneys no longer function correctly. Even worse, Tony had suffered damage to his heart too, going into cardiac arrest in the ambulance. The paramedics had managed to restart his heart, but he was hanging on by a thread. Tony had gone comatose. To keep him alive, his doctors had put him on a ventilator to help him breathe and chilled his body temperature to 91.4 degrees to protect his brain. Gina asked if she could see her brother. The doctor nodded and said that Tony had been sent to the intensive care unit, but he warned her that Tony was in really bad shape, and so it wouldn't be easy to see him like that. Gina nodded and set off for the ICU. A few minutes later, the doctor's words were ringing in Gina's ears when the nurse on duty led her to her brother's door. But the sight of Tony still made Gina stifle a gasp. Her brother lay unconscious on the bed, covered in a pile of gel pads that were cooling his body. His swollen chest heaved up and down as the ventilator pumped oxygen down his throat and into his lungs, all while an IV line sent fluids and medicine into his body. Gina had never seen her big brother look so helpless. She walked up to him and touched his hand. It was cold and limp. Gina always knew Tony's alcohol abuse was going to hurt him if he didn't stop, but she never expected anything this bad. "5 weeks later, Gina stepped into Tony's hospital room carrying an almost empty donut box. Tony had spent 3 weeks in the ICU and then 2 more weeks in a regular hospital room. And as those 5 weeks had passed, Gina had gotten to know every staff member in the wing. And she'd brought them donuts because today was a special day. Tony was finally well enough to move out of the hospital and into a skilled nursing facility. Tony's room was quiet now that many of the monitors and tubes had been disconnected, but he was still bedbound. He needed dialysis 3 times a week while doctors kept trying to save his kidneys. And the ventilator that had been breathing for him was now replaced by a hole in his throat with a tube sticking out, so oxygen could go straight to his lungs. Tony couldn't speak at all because of this tube, but through it all, he was somehow managing to hold up okay emotionally. Gina was genuinely impressed by his determination to get better. Gina sat down next to Tony's bed, looked into his eyes, and took his hand. It was warm and pink, and with great effort, he managed to give her a corny, exaggerated thumbs up. She knew instantly her brother was joking with her. Tony often mocked other people who gave the thumbs up gesture. Gina laughed and gave it right back to him. That was the brother she remembered and loved. Named Matilda Rogers, pulled her cart down the hallway inside of the skilled nursing facility where Tony was staying. Matilda really enjoyed the early shift. In the hours before the building got busy with deliveries and family visits, she had a chance to really connect with most of her patients and give them a little inspiration for the day. She stopped the cart and locked the wheels outside of Tony's room. Tony was one of her favorites. Matilda loved his sense of humor, and she developed a morning ritual of greeting him with a joke or a riddle. During his 2 weeks at the nursing center, Tony had learned to speak again by using a special valve on the hole in his throat. His voice was still raspy and low, but Matilda loved it when she could make him laugh. She also encouraged him to imitate her silly dance moves, and that helped him slowly strengthen his arms and legs, and so he had been making steady progress. But when Matilda stepped into Tony's room, armed with a new joke she'd gotten from her 11-year-old niece, Tony sat stone-faced and silent in the corner. Matilda instantly knew he was not in the mood for jokes this morning. Tony didn't say a word as she crushed his meds into a fine powder and administered them through his feeding tube. When she was done, she washed her hands and asked permission to sit in his guest chair so they could talk. He nodded, so she took a seat and then tried her joke. But Tony didn't respond. She asked if there was something going on that maybe he wanted to share. And eventually, Tony's eyes began to well up, and he would tell her something very strange. He told her in his slow, raspy voice that people from his past had been visiting him in his room. Old friends and family, including folks he hadn't seen for many years, had been suddenly appearing by his bedside. They would stand there and sometimes even speak to Tony for about 10 seconds, but then they would just disappear. Matilda asked him if he'd been having trouble sleeping again. She told him she thought he might have had a disturbing dream, but Tony was adamant that he had not been asleep at all. He said he knew that the people he was seeing in his room were not real, but he definitely was seeing them. It was not a dream. Matilda could see how frightened Tony was, and told him she was going to do everything she could to keep him safe. She walked back into the hallway to the medicine cart, then pulled up her notes from the weekly meeting with the staff psychiatrist. She saw that Tony had been prescribed a new sleep medication a few days ago. Her notes from the night nurse said Tony had tolerated it well, and there were no indications that Tony had been suffering bad dreams or hallucinations. She couldn't understand why cheerful Tony had suddenly turned so dark. Matilda finished delivering meds to the rest of the patients along Tony's hallway and returned to Tony's room half an hour later to see how he was doing. His mood had not changed. In fact, he was even more argumentative and agitated. He insisted that 2 of his former co-workers had come to his bedside while she was gone. Matilda said it was too early for visitors, but Tony didn't even seem to hear her. Suddenly, he pointed across the room, his eyes wide, and told Matilda he saw a little girl trying to pick up a needle off the floor behind her. Matilda turned to look, and of course, there was no girl and no needle. That's when Matilda noted that Tony's face was flushed, and he was breathing rapidly. When she checked his heart rate and blood pressure, she saw those too were rising. This was moving from perhaps just a bad dream to a potential emergency. Matilda asked the change nurse to call 911. 15 minutes later, she helped escort a flailing, agitated Tony, now strapped to a gurney, into an ambulance for an emergency room evaluation. Medication. 2 days later, when nurse's aide, Matilda Rogers, parked her medicine cart in front of Tony's room, she was hopeful that Tony was back to his upbeat, positive self. So she walked into Tony's room wearing a big smile, but she found him flopping and rolling around on the floor, gasping and yelling through the speaking valve on his throat. He was clearly having some kind of a seizure, and so Matilda immediately pressed the emergency call button. Matilda managed to get Tony to stop thrashing and tried to calm him down. Through his garbled cries, she could make out that he was clearly terrified that someone was coming to get him. He claimed that smoke was coming through the walls, and his wide eyes scanned the room constantly, looking for some unseen menace. A moment later, 2 staffers raced into the room to help get Tony back onto his bed, followed by the doctor who was on duty. Clearly, something dangerous was going on in Tony's head, and they needed to find out what it was immediately. The doctor asked Matilda to call for an ambulance to take Tony right back to the emergency room. 3 hours later, Dr. Shaughnessy reviewed Tony's lab results on a monitor next to his bed inside of the ER. Tony's sister, Gina, paced back and forth beside her. Gina had made it clear to Dr. Shaughnessy that she was not leaving until someone could explain to her what was going on with her brother. Dr. Shaughnessy wished she knew. Seeing Tony being wheeled back in from the nursing center 48 hours after she had discharged him was discouraging. It meant that her first guess must have been wrong. Maybe the Ambien sleeping pills were not causing Tony's problems after all. And there was no denying that Tony's condition had deteriorated. He couldn't tell Dr. Shaughnessy what day it was, or where he had just come from. And not only was he more agitated, he now had a low-grade fever, and his heart was racing. In addition, his legs were swollen, and they shook involuntarily when she manipulated his feet. All these signs suggested that Tony might have suffered some injury to his nervous system. Dr. Shaughnessy worried she might have missed something crucial the last time she saw Tony. She had ordered yet another round of scans and x-rays, plus the usual blood work and urinalysis. And all of the tests came back just like the last time, normal. All except the urinalysis. Dr. Shaughnessy explained to Gina that her brother's urine showed that he had contracted a serious urinary tract infection. This sort of infection is common among people who are bedridden, the doctor said, and it could explain Tony's delusions and paranoia. She said that severe UTIs can cause psychological symptoms as the body fights off the bacteria. But she said the good news was that urinary tract infections are completely treatable. Relief washed over Gina's face as Dr. Shaughnessy told her that she was going to admit Tony to the hospital. She was sure that a strong course of antibiotics would get him back on track. Two days later, an attending physician named Lucinda Bragg made her way to Tony's hospital room as she did rounds with her staff. As a senior physician, part of Dr. Bragg's job was to do rounds with the hospital interns and examine particularly challenging cases. And Tony's certainly fit the bill. So far, nobody had been able to figure out what was causing his hallucinations. Dr. Bragg hoped that this collective group might be able to come up with a new idea. As Dr. Bragg introduced herself and the group to Tony, she could see that he remained frightened and trembling, and the monitor showed that his blood pressure and heart rate remained elevated. Dr. Bragg explained to the staff that Tony was being treated for a urinary tract infection that doctors believed was causing the hallucinations. But after 2 days of treatment with strong antibiotics, Dr. Bragg said that Tony's UTI was getting better, but his mental state was not. Just then, Gina entered Tony's room. Dr. Bragg could immediately see the anxiety on Gina's face with all these people in the room, and so Dr. Bragg asked the other doctors to leave for a moment. After reassuring Gina that she was determined to help, Dr. Bragg took another look at Tony's medical history. Everything looked completely normal. There wasn't anything that stood out to her. But then, something occurred to Dr. Bragg. There was a very rare condition that she'd heard about, but had never actually personally treated. It was a condition that most doctors had never heard of, and was caused by something that few people would think could be harmful, let alone potentially fatal. From what Dr. Bragg remembered about it, this condition could cause hallucinations and confusion, affect heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature, and have a severe impact on muscle function. Basically, it explained all of Tony's symptoms, and if it was left untreated, it could be devastating. But before Dr. Bragg said anything about this to Gina, she wanted to get a second opinion. So Dr. Bragg excused herself to the hallway and tracked down a neurologist colleague. When Dr. Bragg told the neurologist about her suspicions, the neurologist could hardly believe it. But he double-checked Tony's charts, and from what he could tell, Dr. Bragg had finally found the answer. Tony and his doctors didn't know it, but he had been unknowingly overdosing on a potent chemical that plays a huge role in controlling our moods and feelings. It's called serotonin, and its primary job is to carry messages between nerves in the brain and throughout the body. But serotonin is best known for the way it improves mood. A whole industry has grown up around pills that stimulate the body's production of what many people call the feel-good chemical. And Tony's blood was flooded with it, to the point where it was causing his brain to go haywire and his body to shut down. This condition is called serotonin syndrome, and Tony was experiencing it because of a mix-up in his medications. When Tony was admitted to the skilled nursing facility, he was accidentally prescribed a second antidepressant. Antidepressants work by increasing the serotonin levels in the brain. But even a double dose of these antidepressants was not enough to trigger the adverse effects of serotonin syndrome. However, Tony was also prescribed yet another medication that can increase serotonin levels. This one was a treatment for his heartburn. And so it was this third medication on top of the double dose of antidepressants that combined to cause his serotonin syndrome. And so after the neurologist confirmed Dr. Bragg's diagnosis, Tony was taken off of those 2 antidepressants, and right away he made an incredible recovery. In the summer of 2023, the owner of an all-night medical shop in Kathmandu was busy restocking shelves. It was late, sometime after midnight, but the man didn't mind. He liked working the overnight shift. It was quiet, and some nights nobody came in at all, which gave him time to do the accounting. But the peace and quiet was shattered when 2 drunken men in their 20s stumbled inside. One of them was covered in blood and leaning hard on the other, barely conscious. The uninjured man explained that his companion needed to be stitched up quick. The shop owner happened to know basic emergency medicine, so he jumped into action. He cleared off the table in the corner of his store and then told the friend to lay the injured man out on the table. Then he went to the back to get his sutures kit. By the time the shop owner returned to the front of the shop, the injured man was lying there babbling drunken nonsense and clutching his stomach. The owner wasted no time though. He rolled a stool up to the table and lifted up the man's shirt. There was this nasty gash in the man's abdomen. It took him a few minutes to clean the wound and staunch the bleeding with gauze. After that, he worked quickly to stitch the edges of the cut back together. After he was done, the friend thanked the shop owner and paid him what little cash he had in his pocket. And then he assured the shop owner he would get his injured friend back home safely. Once the 2 men left and the shop owner began cleaning up the bloodstained table, he also began thinking to himself how glad he was that he was able to help. That man could have easily bled to death, but now he'd be just fine once he sobered up. But the shop owner had no idea that by this time tomorrow, that drunk injured man would have much bigger problems than a bleeding wound. And now here is our first episode called A Clean Break. In the summer of 2023, a 22-year-old backpacker named Jeff was out late, drinking at a bar in Kathmandu, Nepal. Jeff had been traveling alone through South Asia over the past few weeks, and he'd just arrived in Kathmandu from India. So far, he loved Nepal. Over the past 2 days, he'd been exploring all the temples, markets, and food stalls that filled the bustling 2,000-year-old capital. He'd been going out to bars every night after dinner, hanging with locals and fellow tourists alike. Tonight, he'd chosen a bar that was full of people about his age, and the music was all Western pop tunes, so it sort of reminded him of being home. Jeff ordered a potent Nepalese drink called Roxy and struck up a conversation with the man on the next bar stool. He bought his new friend a Roxy as well, and they talked about Jeff's travels for a while. Then someone else joined the conversation, at which point Jeff decided it was time to buy some shots. By the time he paid his bar tab a few hours later, Jeff could barely see straight. He stood up from his bar stool, but he could hardly feel his feet. He only knew he was standing upright because he felt so dizzy. He staggered his way through the crowd. It felt like he was trudging through peanut butter. He swayed a little and stumbled backwards into the group of guys he'd been talking to all evening. They laughed at him, and one of the men gave him a playful push in the back, which sent him spinning into another group of men he didn't know. And these guys did not think the drunken man was so funny. They shoved Jeff back into his original group of friends, but a lot less gently this time. Soon enough, both groups were shoving and pushing, and the last thing Jeff remembered was the feel of someone's fist exploding against his cheekbone. The next morning, Jeff woke up in his hostel bed with the worst headache of his life. It felt like his head had been stuffed in a vice grip. He remembered getting punched the night before, but had no memory of what happened next or how he got home. Frankly, he was just glad to be back in his hostel bed and in one piece, even if his head was pounding. Jeff knew he had some painkillers in his bag somewhere, but the idea of just rifling through his belongings made him feel dizzy. So instead, he just reached for the half-empty bottle of water on his bedside and chugged it down in a single gulp. He felt better for about 30 seconds, but then vomit surged up his throat and he had to dive for the trash can on the far side of the room. He spent the next 5 minutes with his arms wrapped around the trash can, purging the contents of his stomach. It made him feel better, But he was still very achy and nauseous, and he also now had a sharp pain in his gut. It almost felt like he'd pulled a muscle in there or something. Jeff crawled back to his bed and flopped onto the mattress. He decided he would spend the rest of the day in bed, sleeping off this hangover. When Jeff finally woke up again later that day, the sun was setting outside his window. His headache was dull now, and the room had stopped spinning. But the pain in his gut felt sharper, and there was an edge to it that he'd never felt before. Now, Jeff didn't want to be alarmist, but he was all alone in a foreign country very far from home, and so he had this feeling that he should just go to the local emergency room and make sure everything was okay. After a quick dinner break, Dr. Anil Singh walked into the waiting room of the emergency department at the Shankarapur Hospital in Kathmandu. He called his next patient, a foreign tourist named Jeff. Dr. Singh specialized in gastrointestinal problems, and he'd been called down to take a look at Jeff's stomach. He led Jeff to a small examination room, and as they walked there, the doctor immediately noticed the smell of stale alcohol radiating off of Jeff. But he didn't say anything. Instead, once they got to the room, the doctor asked Jeff if he'd been experiencing any symptoms like constipation or stomach distension. And Jeff shook his head and said no. He said he had been hungover and he felt nauseous from it, but that was not why he was at the hospital. The reason he was at the hospital was because of this new shooting pain in his stomach. Dr. Singh nodded and then put on a fresh pair of latex gloves and told Jeff to lie down on the table. After he had, the doctor lifted up Jeff's shirt and instantly saw a large bandage taped over Jeff's abdomen. And then beneath it was a 3-inch long cut with fresh sutures stitching up his skin. Whoever had done the sutures had done a good job, but Dr. Singh was pretty certain this was why Jeff's stomach hurt. He told Jeff that his sutures looked clean and asked where he got the injury. But Jeff looked so confused. He looked at his stomach and then back up at Dr. Singh with this horrified look on his face. Jeff said he had no idea where that injury even came from. He said he remembered getting punched in the face last night at the bar, but had no memory of anything after that, certainly didn't recall getting cut or seeing any kind of doctor who might have stitched him up. Dr. Singh cocked an eyebrow and looked at Jeff like, really? You had no idea you had a wound on your stomach? But as Jeff continued to look totally shocked by this wound, the doctor concluded that maybe Jeff really was telling the truth, that he really didn't know about this cut. And so Dr. Singh examined the wound more closely and told Jeff that it looked like someone had cut him open, like that's what the injury was, you've been cut. And so Dr. Singh ordered an x-ray just to see what was going on in there. Jeff nodded like he understood, but his eyes were staring off into the distance and he had a totally frightened look on his face. He asked the doctor if it was possible that someone had stolen an organ from him while he was blacked out drunk. He'd always heard that in some countries there was a black market for kidneys, but Dr. Singh smiled and told him that that probably did not happen to him. An hour later, Dr. Singh received Jeff's x-ray, and when he pulled it up on his computer to take a look, he was absolutely floored. And so he rushed back to Jeff's hospital room and asked him to tell him whatever he could remember about the night before. And so Jeff saw the urgency on the doctor's face, but admitted that as much as he wanted to remember, it really was all a blur. He remembered drinking way too much and getting punched in the face at some point, but he had no idea how he had gotten back to his hostel room after that. Dr. Singh was in awe of how drunk Jeff must have been, to have basically no memory of the night before. But he told Jeff that ultimately he would be okay, but based on his x-ray, he would have to get in the operating room right away. He needed immediate surgery. Jeff, who was already pale, got even paler and asked Dr. Singh to explain what was wrong with him. What did he find? Dr. Singh sighed, sat down next to Jeff, and then broke the incredible news. The moment those x-ray images came back, Dr. Singh knew exactly what was causing Jeff's discomfort. There was a 6-inch long knife blade lodged inside of Jeff's body. Dr. Singh told Jeff that at some point the night before, he must have been stabbed, and apparently stabbed so hard that the knife blade had broken off inside of his abdomen. And somehow, Jeff was so drunk, he didn't remember any of it. Dr. Singh decided to call the bar, hoping that somebody there would know the whole story. And luckily, the bartender who answered the phone had been working there the night before and had seen the whole thing. Jeff had made some friends at the bar last night, but apparently he had made some enemies too. And during the physical altercation that ensued with these enemies, someone stabbed Jeff with what looked like a chef's knife, and then one of the onlookers took Jeff to the nearest medical shop, which are these 24-hour pharmacies that can be found all over Kathmandu. And so once they got there, the onlooker begged the shop owner to sew Jeff up, and the shop owner did, even though he was not a doctor. And because he was not a doctor, the shop owner, before stitching him up, didn't think to check whether there were any foreign objects inside of Jeff first, hence the knife being left inside of Jeff. And then afterwards, when Jeff was sleeping off his hangover back at his hostel, that knife blade traveled inside of him through his innards until it was lodged deep inside of Jeff's torso. It was a miracle that it didn't cause further damage to Jeff's internal organs as it worked its way deeper into the muscle of his abdominal cavity. And so it was no wonder Jeff was in extreme pain by the time he got to the ER. Jeff was taken to the operating room, where surgeons were able to extract the knife blade from his abdominal cavity. Then they patched him up, and he was discharged from the hospital 5 days later. Ultimately, Jeff would travel back to his home country once he was healthy enough to travel, and although he couldn't remember the most exciting part of his trip, getting stabbed, he would always have the scar as a souvenir. On the morning of January 14, 1996, Alana Rugen carried her 6-year-old son Jaden as they walked towards the Tropical Discovery Center at the Denver Zoo. She was eager to get out of the cold, especially since most of the exhibits they'd visited so far had been outside. They'd seen the penguins, the tigers, and the gorillas, but Jaden loved snakes, so the reptiles at the Discovery Center were like the main event. Alana let Jaden run ahead of her as they entered the building. And then after going inside and collecting her son, they went to sit in a little auditorium that normally showed a short reptile documentary. But this afternoon, the movie was turned off, and 2 zookeepers were welcoming a small crowd to fill the seats. After the audience was seated, the zookeepers began bringing out all kinds of snakes and lizards and tortoises, holding them up for the kids to see, and also telling the audience all about the animals and where they came from. Alana watched her son's eyes light up when they brought out a massive 12-foot-long boa constrictor and stretched him out on the floor, his forked tongue flicking in and out of his mouth. Alana was thrilled that she'd signed her son up for this little excursion. He seemed to be really enjoying it so far. Just then, one of the zookeepers carried a lizard into the bleachers so the kids could get a closer look. Jaden immediately reached out his hand to try and pet the lizard, but Alana grabbed him and pulled his hand back before he could make contact. The zookeepers had been very clear that this event was a reptile meet and greet, not a meet and touch. By the time the show was over, Jaden was buzzing. He was jumping up and down and telling his mom all about his favorite animals and what he remembered about each one. She smiled as she led him to the next exhibit, called Komodo Days. It was a limited-time indoor exhibit that had just opened a few days earlier, showcasing 4 of the largest lizards on Earth, called Komodo dragons. Each of the animals was bigger than Jaden, and that was actually still small for a Komodo dragon. Alana overheard someone reading from a plaque that said these animals could grow up to 10 feet long and weigh about 350 pounds. The zoo was hoping to raise enough funds to build a large permanent enclosure for these new arrivals to the zoo. For the time being, though, these giant lizards were being kept in a temporary exhibit, enclosed by a 2-foot-tall wooden barrier, which the lizards were not capable of climbing over. To make sure nobody got too close, there was a line of plants in front of the barrier, all surrounded by a chain and post fence. Alana was more than happy to keep her distance. She had to admit that the Komodo dragons were cool, although their exhibit smelled horrible, like damp mulch and manure. But Jaden was so excited, he barely seemed to notice. Alana stood with Jaden right behind the fence, and from where they were standing, they had a good view into the enclosure. Alana thought the dragons looked a bit like alligators, with big heads and short stubby legs and long muscular tails. She then leaned over and began to read from the plaque of animal facts fastened to the barrier. She told Jaden that apparently these dragons were poisonous and had razor-sharp teeth, and they eat almost any kind of meat, from rodents to water buffaloes. Jaden listened and watched in fascination as the dragons lumbered around their enclosure, their big nails crunching on the mulch that had been put on the floor. He giggled as one of the dragons stood up on a rock and stuck its big yellow tongue out, hissing at the crowd. Jaden was so entranced by these dragons that he leaned over the fence to get a better look, and actually reached towards a Komodo dragon that was only a few feet away, near the edge of its enclosure. And as this happened, that same dragon put its paws up on the 2-foot wooden wall to get a better look at Jaden. Alana saw this and gasped and grabbed her son and pulled him back. All that was separating him from one of the deadliest predators on Earth was a line of decorative bushes. Thankfully, she had pulled him away in time, although it felt way too close for comfort. Alana let Jaden continue to watch the Komodo dragons, but this time a little bit farther back from the barrier. And then after about 15 minutes, Alana's stomach began to rumble, so she told her son they needed to leave now, but they would stop at the cafeteria and grab some food before heading home. A few mornings later, Alana went upstairs to wake her son for school. But when she entered Jaden's room, he complained that his stomach hurt, and he was afraid that he was going to throw up. Now, normally Jaden was pretty enthusiastic about school, so Alana decided he must really be sick. So she told him he would stay home today and rest up, and then she went and got him some Gatorade. A few hours later, Alana was in the kitchen grabbing saltine crackers for Jaden when she heard him cry upstairs. She ran upstairs and found him still in bed, but now sweating with a fever and shivering with chills at the same time. When she took his temperature, it read 104 degrees. Alana was shocked. This seemed more serious than just a 24-hour bug, and so she decided to bring him to the doctor. But before they left to go see the doctor, she had Jaden use the bathroom and discovered he was passing bloody diarrhea, which really scared her. Once he was cleaned up, she rushed him out the front door and sped to the hospital as fast as she could. About 10 days later, on January 26th, Dr. Barbara Raffa knocked on Alana's front door. Dr. Raffa was an investigator with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and had recently learned that Jaden was one of 7 children in the Denver metro area who had been infected with a strain of salmonella called Salmonella enteritis that's commonly found in poultry and other animals. Dr. Raffa and her team were trying to figure out where the children had picked up the salmonella bacteria, which is usually spread by consuming contaminated food or water or having contact with infected animals. The doctor reassured Alana that most people recover from a salmonella infection, but it can be dangerous to young kids. In fact, if kids go untreated for salmonella, they can die. Dr. Raffa had spent the past few days interviewing the families with the kids who were sick with salmonella and had asked hospitals to report any new cases. She had the sinking feeling that this was the beginning of an outbreak, so she and her team needed to act fast to figure out what was going on here. Alana knew her son had salmonella poisoning, but had no idea that other kids were also getting salmonella poisoning too. Dr. Raffa followed Alana to the kitchen, and the pair sat down at the kitchen table, and Dr. Raffa asked how Jaden was doing. Alana said her son was upstairs sleeping and still was a bit tired and weak, but he seemed to be recovering. She had taken him to the emergency room last week, where he was diagnosed with salmonella based on his symptoms. He'd been given fluids and antibiotics, which had definitely helped him get better. The hospital monitored him for a few days until the salmonella had passed through his body. Dr. Raffa told Alana how relieved she was that Jaden was okay. But now she was hoping to try to stop the spread of the salmonella strain before it affected more kids. And so she said she had a list of questions she wanted to ask Alana in the hopes that maybe she could help her figure out exactly how Jaden got sick. Alana nodded and said she was eager to help. Dr. Raffa began by asking if she and her son had gone anywhere unusual over the past 2 weeks. Alana shrugged and said not really, except they did go to the zoo the weekend before last. She said they'd gone to see the reptiles. By now, Dr. Raffa had been expecting this answer. Every other family she'd spoken to whose kid was sick with salmonella told her they had gone to the Discovery Center at the zoo, which made it obvious to Dr. Raffa that this particular strain of salmonella had to be stemming from something in that building. So now it was time to head to the zoo and figure out what that might be. The next day, Dr. Raffa and her colleagues arrived at the Tropical Discovery Center. As the zookeeper led her and her colleagues through the employees-only area of the exhibit, Dr. Raffa felt a sense of urgency. By now, Dr. Raffa had identified 33 children who had contracted the same strain of salmonella as Jaden over the past 2 weeks. And each family had this one thing in common. They had all visited this Discovery Center. And so now it was extremely apparent that something in this building was behind the kids getting sick. And for all Dr. Rafa knew, kids were actively being exposed to salmonella right now. So far, they'd been lucky. All 33 families of the sick kids had taken their children to a hospital, so they were all going to be fine. However, Dr. Rafa worried that eventually, if this outbreak continued, that a family would think whatever was going on with their kids was just a mild stomach bug. And then by the time they realized their mistake, it would be too late for their child. She pushed that thought from her mind and went back to work. She had to figure out which animal or exhibit was carrying the salmonella bacteria, and most importantly, how the kids were coming into contact with it. And that was proving to be a real mystery. As Dr. Rafa walked through the Discovery Center, she noticed that almost all of the exhibits were completely sealed off. There was no way for the public to come in contact directly with any of the reptiles or any of their environments. She asked the zookeeper about the animals they used in their daily education shows. She wondered if maybe the kids were allowed to touch any of them. But the zookeeper shook his head. He told her that the public never touched any of the animals because that was unsafe for both the people and the animals. But Dr. Rafa wasn't convinced. She said she wanted stool samples from all of the education animals just to make sure they weren't carrying the salmonella bacteria. She also wanted samples from the rodents that were used to feed those animals, because she was not going to take any chances. About 20 minutes later, Dr. Rafa scooped up a bit of fecal matter from a blue-tongued skink and dropped it into a tiny plastic tube. Then she labeled it for testing back in the lab. Along the back hallway, her teammates were collecting stool samples from corn snakes, the big boa constrictor, and all the other reptiles used in the daily show. And they were making good progress, which she was glad for. She kept imagining a sick child in bed at home, their parents unaware that their stomach bug was actually a potentially deadly disease from their trip to the zoo. She hurried the sample she had just collected to a small examination room down the hallway, an area that was usually for veterinary visits, but that her team was using now as a home base while they examined the Discovery Center. And when she got there, it was then that Dr. Rafa remembered the Komodo dragon exhibit that they had passed on the way in. She had a thought. The Komodo dragons were a new exhibit, and even though the Komodo dragons were kept out of reach of the public, the timing of their arrival and the outbreak of this disease was too close to ignore. Curious, she went to find the zookeeper. She wanted samples from all 4 of the dragons, hoping that her gut feeling would solve this mystery. On the morning of February 1st, so about 2 weeks after Jaden got sick, Dr. Paul Nelson arrived at the Denver Zoo, alongside a small team of fellow investigators from the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC. A few days earlier, all the samples that Dr. Rafa had collected came back from the lab, and all of the animals were salmonella-free except one, a Komodo dragon. And it tested positive for the exact strain of salmonella that had infected all the children. So now, Dr. Rafa had clearly identified the source of the salmonella outbreak, but an equally important question was looming. How could the kids come into contact with the bacteria that was on this Komodo dragon when they and the public were not allowed to touch the Komodo dragons in the first place? The dragons and the public were clearly separated by a low plywood wall, a row of bushes, and a fence. And so Dr. Rafa was stumped, and that's why she had called the CDC to take over the case. A zoo administrator welcomed Dr. Nelson and his colleagues into the Discovery Center and then led them into a back room where 6 other zoo employees were waiting. Most of them were the zookeepers who worked directly with the infected Komodo dragon. And so Dr. Nelson said he needed stool samples from all of them to make sure that none of them were sick and spreading the salmonella strain themselves when they interacted with the public. Dr. Nelson also said they would need additional fecal samples from some of the animals at the center just to play it safe. And then after that, Dr. Nelson's teammates spread out all across the Discovery Center and began collecting samples of their own. Not fecal samples, but surface samples. They were swabbing basically every surface they possibly could. Everything from the plants to the fences to the mulch on the ground. By the time Dr. Nelson and his team left the zoo an hour later, they had this massive bag full of samples to test. About 5 days later, Dr. Nelson returned to the Discovery Center with surprising news about the CDC's analysis of all the samples they had taken. In addition to finding the salmonella strain in the Komodo dragon stool, they had also found the salmonella strain in a very unlikely place. It was sitting on top of the wooden barrier that was supposed to keep the dragons away from the public. Dr. Nelson admitted to the zoo officials that he was really confused. And so he just kind of began walking around near the Komodo dragon enclosure, wondering, how could the salmonella get there? And right as he walked over to the fence, he noticed one of the dragons walking over to him to kind of check him out. And a second later, the dragon stood up on its hind legs and propped its paws right on the wooden barrier. And suddenly, it all made sense. It would turn out the Komodo dragon enclosure was covered with mulch. The Komodo dragons slept in that mulch, walked in that mulch, and went to the bathroom in that mulch. Then they occasionally put their feet up on the wooden barrier to get a better look at their guests, transferring bits of salmonella-infected mulch and fecal matter onto the wooden fence in the process. The children, meanwhile, were so excited to see these giant lizards that they were leaning way over the security fence and sometimes actually touching the top of the wooden barrier. They didn't know it, but they were actually getting salmonella on their hands. And so at that point, if the kids didn't wash their hands, all they would have to do to get infected with the salmonella would be to just brush their nose or rub their eyes, or in Jaden's case, eat some food with their bare hands. Thankfully, the salmonella outbreak was treated fast enough that all 33 infected children made full recoveries. And the Denver Zoo managed to raise enough money for the Komodo dragon exhibit that they could build a permanent enclosure, this one completely sealed off from the public. It's actually still at the Denver Zoo today, and there has not been a single salmonella outbreak in nearly 2 decades. In the winter of 2022, a mom in her mid-30s sat in the bleachers at the local ice hockey rink, cheering on her 6-year-old son. She always enjoyed watching these hockey games. The kids were adorable as they slipped around the ice, trying to control the hockey puck. Her son was small for his age. He was so tiny, she almost hadn't signed him up for the team again this year. But he loved hockey and his teammates, so she didn't have the heart to say no. The mom clapped and hollered when her son got the puck and started skating toward the opposite goal. Then he swung his stick and the puck went sailing past the other team's goalie. Her son threw his arms up in celebration, and then he suddenly crumpled to the ice in pain. Fear ran through the mother as she heard her son's wail. Nobody had touched him. All he'd done was swing a stick and raise his arms. But he was crying so hard, it was like he'd broken a bone or cracked his head open on the ice. The referee skated over to the boy to see what was wrong as the mother raced down the bleachers to her son's side. She didn't know if she should call him an ambulance or just tell him to snap out of it. But judging from how loud he was screaming, the pain he was feeling was very real. Caroline smiled and went back into the kitchen, where their nanny was cutting up some veggie sticks for a snack. She was about to grab a knife and help when the screaming outside turned from fun to painful. Caroline dashed back outside and found her husband kneeling next to Andrew. The little 4-year-old was curled up on his side, sobbing with pain. Caroline helped Brian scoop Andrew into his arms, then followed them inside. Brian laid Andrew on the sofa in the living room so that he and Caroline could try to figure out if the boy had any broken bones. But after a minute of prodding, Caroline felt sure that nothing was seriously wrong. Besides, Brian assured her that Andrew hadn't landed hard or anything. He just bounced a little, then started screaming. This whole situation definitely seemed odd, but Caroline assumed that, he must have just landed at an odd angle or something. She gave him some Motrin to help with the pain, and after a few minutes, Andrew did calm down. And by dinner time, he was back to his usual happy-go-lucky self. By the following morning, Caroline had put the whole bouncy house incident out of her mind. She left Brian watching the kids while she hopped on a morning Zoom call for work. Halfway through the call, though, Caroline heard a piercing scream in the yard. It was Andrew again. She turned off her camera and raced downstairs. By the time she got to the backyard, the nanny was kneeling beside Andrew, who was once again in the fetal position and crying. Caroline asked if Andrew had fallen down, but the nanny said no. He was just standing there, and then he suddenly yelped and fell to the ground, and Andrew had been crying ever since. Caroline couldn't tell if Andrew was truly in pain or if he was just having a meltdown. She picked up her son and asked what was wrong, but it was clear he was in no mood to talk. He just cried. Caroline wasn't sure what to make of it. Andrew was not the kind of little boy to throw temper tantrums. but she also knew that every child gets overwhelmed sometimes. Besides, he hadn't seen his friends in months because of the COVID lockdown, and he was tired of being at home all the time. And so Caroline decided he must just be having a moment. Still, she gave him another Motrin, and about 15 minutes later, Andrew was back to normal. It suddenly occurred to Caroline that Andrew's molars might be coming in, which could be extremely painful. Once he was outside playing with the nanny again, she picked up the phone to call his dentist. A few weeks later, an orthodontist named Dr. Tyson Graham sat down on a stool in his treatment room and turned to face little Andrew, who was sitting up in the examination chair. Andrew's mom was in the corner, looking anxious. Dr. Graham smiled at her, then explained to Andrew how he was going to try to help the little boy with the pain he'd been experiencing lately. Andrew's regular dentist had already taken x-rays of Andrew's mouth and found that Andrew had been grinding his teeth at night. Teeth grinding can cause difficulty breathing at night, and the dentist thought that might explain why Andrew had been so moody and exhausted recently. He wasn't sleeping well. So the dentist had referred Andrew to Dr. Graham, thinking that the orthodontist might find a way to prevent the boy's teeth grinding. But as Dr. Graham examined Andrew's mouth, he found a different issue. Andrew's palate, the roof of his mouth, was too narrow for his age. In Dr. Graham's opinion, that, not teeth, to install the palate expander. A month later, Caroline squeezed into the bathroom with Andrew and Robin, squirting little dabs of bubblegum toothpaste onto their toothbrushes. Then all three of them brushed their teeth together, a little bedtime routine they'd fallen into recently. Mostly, this was so Caroline could make sure they actually did it, but it was also to make sure Andrew used the special mouthwash she had bought him to keep his palate expander nice and clean. Caroline was tired, and she could tell her kids were exhausted too. They'd spent all day outside, playing a socially distanced version of hide-and-seek they'd made up with the neighborhood kids. Caroline was glad to see Andrew back to his old self. It seemed like the palate expander had really worked. As the kids got into their pajamas, Andrew asked if his mother would measure them against the doorframe in their bedroom. Caroline smiled. She had been marking their heights there since they were old enough to stand. Robin chimed in that she wanted to be measured too. Caroline knew why there was suddenly all this interest in being measured. The neighborhood kids had been bragging about how tall they'd gotten, so of course her kids wanted to know too. Caroline told Robin to stand against the door jamb and carefully marked her height with a pencil. When Robin stepped away, it looked like she had grown a full inch since they'd last measured her. Caroline wrote the date on the jamb as Robin grinned. Then it was Andrew's turn. But after she measured him and Andrew stepped away, it looked like he had barely grown at all. Andrew frowned, looking at his sister's mark with a tinge of jealousy. Caroline assured him he would grow by next month, but she knew this was unusual for a 4-year-old kid. He should be growing like a weed, and so she decided she would make an appointment with the pediatrician in the morning, just to make sure nothing was wrong. But later that week, Caroline felt frustrated as she paced her kitchen, listening while Andrew's pediatrician explained over the phone that Andrew was not growing because of the pandemic. The stress of all the isolation and fear was negatively affecting Andrew's growth, and unfortunately, because they were still in the pandemic, there really wasn't much they could do. They should just wait it out for a few months. But as she hung up the phone, she felt certain that something was wrong with Andrew, and it had nothing to do with COVID-19. 2021, about 9 months after Andrew first started experiencing these sudden bouts of extreme pain, Caroline took him back to his pediatrician for a follow-up. She let Andrew walk ahead of her into the office. She intentionally trailed behind him a little so she could watch his stride. She saw he was dragging his left foot instead of picking it up and actually stepping with it. He'd been doing this whole past week. It was like his right foot was doing all the walking and his left foot was just along for the ride. At this point, it was another symptom to add to the list. Over the past few months, Andrew had been having headaches and meltdowns again. Besides that, he seemed exhausted all the time. The Motrin still helped somewhat, but Caroline could see him getting more solemn and less playful with each passing day. She knew her baby was in pain, and it had to be due to something other than his narrow palate or the pandemic. Caroline had taken him to several doctors, trying to get some answers. A neurologist had told her that Andrew had migraines, while an ear, nose, and throat doctor still believed her son was having breathing issues while sleeping, and so he likely couldn't fall into a deep, undisturbed sleep, which explained why he was so tired. But to Caroline, none of these doctors were addressing the root problem. She felt like each doctor was focusing on one single symptom, but nobody was taking a step back to see the whole picture. What was the underlying condition or disease that was causing all these symptoms? And until somebody could put all the puzzle pieces together, Andrew would be the one suffering. But no matter how many times she tried to communicate this with all the doctors and specialists, it was like nobody seemed to understand. Caroline felt like she was losing her mind, but all she could do was just keep going to more doctors. And so she'd taken Andrew back to his pediatrician's office, hoping maybe he might finally have a real answer for her. While the pediatrician measured Andrew's height and weight, Caroline went through all of Andrew's symptoms. She expected the doctor to offer some kind of overarching explanation. Instead, he just stood upright and told her there was good news. Andrew had grown a bit since his last appointment. Caroline supposed that was good, but the rest of Andrew's symptoms showed no improvement whatsoever. And on the whole, Andrew wasn't feeling good. He was still in pain. And now there was this lazy foot issue. She wanted to know how they could start actively helping her son, instead of just tracking all his symptoms. The pediatrician suggested that Caroline put her son in physical therapy to correct his foot imbalance. He promised to write a referral. Caroline thanked him, though secretly she felt overwhelmed by how many appointments this would likely add to their already doctor-heavy calendar. But it just felt like there was nothing else she could do. She had to go through with it. So she smiled and promised the doctor she would get Andrew into therapy soon. Later that week, while Andrew was going through his physical therapy routine, Caroline, who was in the room watching him, felt uneasy. Andrew's therapist, Miss Ashley, was walking Andrew through an examination. Caroline smiled as Andrew walked around the room with a determined look on his face. Miss Ashley took notes and told him he was doing a great job. Then Miss Ashley asked him to sit cross-legged on the floor. Andrew tried, but he couldn't quite get his legs to cross over one another. One leg would bend, but he couldn't bend his other leg enough to sit upright. Before long, he got frustrated and told Miss Ashley he couldn't do it. Miss Ashley said that was okay, and then they moved on to other activities. After his session was over, Andrew came running over to his mom, and Caroline scooped him up. She let him rest his head on her shoulder, and then Miss Ashley came over and explained that Andrew might have a congenital condition called Chiari malformation. That's when a part of the brain, called the cerebellum, bulges through an opening at the back of the skull, right where the skull joins the spinal canal. The bulge puts pressure on the cerebellum and the spinal cord. It can cause severe headaches, scoliosis, and sleep apnea, which is when breathing becomes interrupted during sleep. If Andrew did have a Chiari malformation, he could need surgery. The thought sent a shiver through Caroline. She never thought that Andrew might need to be cut open. She hated picturing it, and she had no idea how she was going to explain it to him. The following winter, in 2022, Caroline was in Andrew's bedroom helping him into his pajamas, the same pair of red flannel pajamas that he'd been wearing for 2 years now. It felt like his sister Robin outgrew her clothes every few months, but Andrew hadn't needed new pajamas or t-shirts since before COVID. Andrew was 6 years old now, but he still looked like he was closer to 4, and this evening he was throwing a tantrum like a bona fide toddler. But Caroline didn't blame him. After dinner, she and Brian had taken Andrew out for ice cream and broke the news. Because of what was going on with him, he had to quit his hockey team. The skating was causing too much pain in his knees and back. It was just too much for his underdeveloped body. At first, Caroline just felt heartbroken for making Andrew so sad. But now, she was so frustrated, she was becoming angry at all the doctors. She was tired of having to tell Andrew that nobody knew why his body was failing him. The latest theory, that Andrew had Chiari malformation, wasn't right either. Andrew had tested negative for the condition last year. Since then, Caroline and Brian had taken their son to countless more specialists. A new pediatrician for a second opinion, a pediatric internist, even an adult internist, just in case they found something different. In total, Andrew had seen 17 different doctors over the last 3 years. But all those doctors were still stuck in a cycle of treating his symptoms individually. Caroline finally got Andrew into bed, though it broke her heart to leave him red-faced and tear-streaked, his little arms wrapped around his favorite stuffed animal. She went downstairs and started scrolling on her phone just to decompress. A Facebook friend had posted an article that looked interesting about a new artificial intelligence software called ChatGPT. You could ask it any question, no matter how complex, and it would scan the whole internet in a matter of seconds to generate an answer. People were using it to create marketing plans for their companies, to write blog posts, and to make mashups like fairy tales written in the style of a mafia movie, or resignation letters if they were written by famous TV characters. It seemed like a fun way to spend an hour, so Caroline started messing around with ChatGPT. When Brian came into the living room and sat down next to her on the sofa, she read him some of the funniest mashups it had made. Brian laughed and then joked that she should try to use it to diagnose Andrew. Caroline laughed dismissively, but then she wondered. It was a long shot, but why not? Maybe ChatGPT would find some rare, obscure disease that most specialists had never heard of. Or maybe it would unearth some clue, some pivotal question to ask that would help one of his doctors see the whole picture. The worst that could happen was nothing, really. So Caroline started typing all of Andrew's symptoms into ChatGPT. She even went and got her copy of medical notes from an MRI he'd gotten and typed them in, line by line. It was a tedious process, especially doing it on her phone, but eventually when she was done, she hit enter and waited. A few moments later, the little text box started suggesting possible answers, but they were all conditions that Andrew had already been tested for. Caroline's heart sank. She felt stupid for thinking this brand new internet AI chat box could magically diagnose her child, but then she realized she actually had left out one of his symptoms, the fact that he could no longer sit cross-legged. She told ChatGPT to redo the search, including that symptom, and within moments, it suggested a condition that she'd never heard of, and none of Andrew's doctors had ever mentioned it either. But as she started reading the symptoms of this condition aloud, Brian sat up straight, his eyes going wide. He ran to get his laptop, and Caroline started researching on her phone. Eventually, she found a Facebook group for families living with and caring for those with this condition, and to her surprise, their stories were nearly identical to Andrew's. A week later, Caroline was bursting with anticipation as she sat next to Andrew in a brand new doctor's office. They were waiting to see Dr. Hannah Gordon, a pediatric neurosurgeon. Caroline had brought a packet of research with her and had it waiting on her lap for when the doctor came in. She hoped that by the end of the appointment, Dr. Gordon would be able to officially diagnose Andrew, and that Caroline would finally know what was wrong with her son. When Dr. Gordon finally came into the exam room, Caroline introduced herself and explained that usually she was not one to surf the internet and self-diagnose, but she'd actually found some compelling evidence online, and then she handed over the research packet she'd compiled, and she watched the doctor read over it. When Dr. Gordon laid eyes on Andrew's MRI scans, she smiled and told Caroline that she was fairly certain she did know how to help Andrew. Dr. Gordon explained that Andrew was suffering from a condition called tethered cord syndrome, the same condition that ChatGPT had identified. The spinal cord runs like a cable through the bones that make up the spine, from the base of the skull to the tailbone. However, in rare cases, the spinal cord improperly attaches itself to something inside the bones of the spinal column. As a result, the spinal cord's movement is limited. In short, it gets stuck. Andrew's spinal cord was stuck to one of those growing spinal bones, causing him extreme pain and all his other symptoms. It was also why he couldn't sit cross-legged, a symptom that's so common among people with tethered cord syndrome that ChatGPT recognized the pattern. Caroline believes that ChatGPT was able to diagnose Andrew because it was doing the very thing she had spent years asking doctors to do. It took a step back and considered all of Andrew's symptoms, instead of picking and choosing or focusing on them one by one. Luckily for Andrew, he was able to undergo surgery to detach his spinal cord from where it was stuck. Once the tension was gone, Andrew's symptoms soon disappeared, and he went back to his happy-go-lucky self. For real this time. A middle-aged man rolled out of his bed, scratching at his hands and reaching for the lotion by his bed. He'd been battling dry hands since the summer, but these past few days, it was like his hands had been burning. He rubbed the lotion into his hands and up his arms as he shuffled down the hall to the bathroom. Once he was inside, he closed the door behind him so he wouldn't wake up his wife, and then he turned on the light to get ready for work. The man grabbed Vaseline out of the medicine cabinet, hoping that it might soothe his skin better than the lotion had. But as he began working a glob of it into his hands and his arms, he felt loose skin flaking off between his fingers. Then he looked down into the sink, and he saw dozens of what at first looked like inch-wide paint chips around the drain. The man instinctively looked up at the bathroom ceiling, hoping to see that maybe the paint was just chipping, but it looked perfectly normal. Then he glanced at the mirror, and he saw his arms were completely covered in strips of peeling skin up to his elbows. And where the skin had fallen away into the sink, his forearms looked red and raw, like uncooked meat. Now the man was really getting worried. He thought he just had some dry patches, but now he looked like a snake shedding his entire skin. What in the world was happening to him? And now, here's our first story called Just Like the Movies. On a cold fall morning in 1999, 51-year-old Martin Henry walked across the linoleum flooring at the Glister Mary Lee popcorn plant in Jasper, Missouri. The fluorescent lights overhead glinted on all the stainless steel machinery that covered the manufacturing floor. Workers bustled around their stations, already hard at work despite the early hour. A young man followed behind Martin as he walked the plant floor. He was a new hire, and he was taking notes as Martin pointed at different machines and explained how they worked. He gestured at the dozens of employees working all around the room and jokingly told the new guy that he should try to meet everybody. The new guy just started laughing. That's because the new guy knew everybody here already. Jasper was a town of just 1,000 people, and the popcorn factory employed about 15% of them. Martin had instantly recognized the new guy from around town the moment he had showed up that day. Martin led the new hire over to the workstation that he knew best, the mixer room where he had worked for most of the past 2 years. Martin manned the machine that coated each popcorn kernel with buttery flavoring. He liked to think of himself as the guy who made the popcorn taste just like it did at the movies. Martin took a keyring out of his pocket and turned on the mixing machines. A moment later, a puff of yellow mist leaked out of the top of the largest mixer, and right away this wonderful buttery scent filled the air. Martin peeled off his rubber gloves and grabbed a new pair. Then he showed the new guy how to work all the different buttons and toggles in the mixing room and what the different level readings meant. Then he pressed a few buttons, and the machine hummed into action. Martin stepped aside and told his new trainee to give the mixers a try. So the young man turned on the spigot on one of the 2 smaller mixing tanks, letting butter flavoring pour out into a plastic 5-gallon bucket. As Martin stood there with his hands on his hips, he felt proud of his work. But he also felt distracted because his arms felt so dry and itchy. They had been that way all week, something he blamed on the changing weather. He was glad that his thick rubber gloves and long-sleeved white coat prevented him from scratching. Otherwise, he feared he might scratch himself bloody. But after only a few minutes of standing there, Martin just couldn't stand the itching any longer. So he excused himself from the new hire and then hustled over to the locker room where he could scratch himself to his heart's content and douse himself in more lotion. A few months later, Martin's wife, Linda Henry, rolled out of bed and began walking over to the bathroom she shared with her husband. As she did, she heard her husband moving, and she turned and saw him roll over in bed and reach for the phone on the nightstand. To protect his skin, Martin's hands were actually wrapped in plastic bags, which crinkled as he punched in the phone number he was trying to press. He was calling into work, letting them know he needed a sick day to deal with his ongoing skin problem. She heard him say that the pain was unbearable, which to her seemed like an understatement. Linda walked into the bathroom and opened up the medicine cabinet and grabbed a half-empty jar of Vaseline. For the past few weeks, her husband's hands had been so chapped and flaky that Linda had been coating them in Vaseline and then wrapping them in those plastic bags while he slept, both to prevent scratching and to keep the skin from falling off onto their sheets. For the past couple of weeks, the skin on Martin's hands and legs had gotten so papery and ashen that it had started falling off in 2 to 3 inch chunks. Now, historically, Martin did typically get dry hands in the winter, but it had never gotten this bad before. Linda couldn't imagine what might be causing this severe skin condition, but she was very worried about her husband. He seemed to always be in pain. At first, she blamed his job at the factory. Constant hand washing and changing rubber gloves and cleaning the machines with harsh chemicals couldn't be doing him any favors. But Martin assured her that none of his symptoms got worse while he was at work, and they didn't improve while he was home. Besides, none of the other employees had developed skin conditions. Now, Martin's reasoning made enough sense, but now, as Linda helped Martin remove the bags from his Vaseline-covered hands, it was clear, at least to her, that something was terribly wrong here, and almost certainly it had to do with his job. I mean, what else could it be? And so after saying as much to her husband, Martin finally relented and said that he would file for workers' compensation insurance, claiming he had developed the skin disease from work. 2 months later, Linda was just about to start making dinner when she heard the mail fall through the slot in their front door. Her eyes widened when she saw it was an envelope from the factory's insurance company. She hoped it was good news about her husband's workers' compensation. She carried the envelope into the living room where Martin was sitting back in his easy chair. His hands were covered in bloody red patches where his skin had fallen off, but now Martin had more to worry about than just a skin disease. Over the past few weeks, Martin had also developed severe difficulty breathing, which really frightened Linda. He'd gone to the doctor, but the doctor said very likely his shortness of breath was unconnected to whatever was going on with his dry skin. The doctor said his breathing issue seemed like a standard case of bronchitis, or maybe he'd developed asthma. But none of the medicines the doctor prescribed for these conditions had helped Martin's breathing. And so Martin spent most days coughing and wheezing, and sometimes even gasping for air. He could barely get up the stairs to their bedroom at night. The recliner was the only place he felt somewhat comfortable. When Linda entered the room, she could see her husband was asleep in the chair. She could hear his soft wheezing. But she felt like this envelope was worth waking him up for. They really needed some good news, and this could be it. So she walked over and tapped gently on her husband's shoulder, and he opened his eyes and immediately just began hacking and coughing, as always. Linda handed him the letter, and when he saw what it was, his eyes went wide. He was eager to see what it would say. By this point, because of Martin's medical issues, he basically didn't leave the house anymore. And he hadn't gone back to work ever since that day he called in sick 2 months earlier. And he and his wife were just at a loss. They couldn't understand how Martin, a seemingly healthy 51-year-old man, could become this sick so quickly. And out of the two of them, Linda was also very convinced that whatever was going on with him really did have to do with his job. It had to be the cause. Also, by now, rumors were starting to spread that other workers at the factory had also become ill. Although they didn't seem as bad off as Martin, their symptoms were similar: wheezing cough, trouble breathing, and this horrible skin rash. And so as Linda watched her now very frail husband open up this envelope, causing bits of his skin to flake off and fall to the carpet, she hoped the other men from the factory would also apply for workers' compensation too, because clearly something was terribly wrong at that factory. Linda watched Martin take the sheet of paper out of the envelope and read it over. Then Martin cursed and told her bitterly that his workers' compensation claim had been denied. The company's doctor had evaluated Martin before his breathing problems started, and so the only thing he had been evaluated for was his skin condition. And there wasn't enough evidence to prove his dry, flaking skin was caused by conditions at the factory. And so if Martin and Linda were going to get some financial help, it would have to come from somewhere else. A few weeks later, in April of 2000, Dr. Thomas Carter reviewed some paperwork at his desk in Kansas City, Missouri. Dr. Carter was an occupational health physician, and he'd been alerted to the strange medical cases coming out of the popcorn plant in Joplin. Over the past few weeks, Dr. Carter had interviewed Martin, along with 7 other popcorn factory workers, all of them struggling to breathe and suffering rashes all over their bodies. He now had medical records for all 8 workers, and the details had shocked him. All 8 had been given different diagnoses, like asthma, bronchitis, and emphysema, but their symptoms were almost identical. All 8 men were struggling to get air into their lungs, and medication had been ineffective in treating their symptoms. One of the workers was 44 years old, but his lung capacity had been reduced to that of a small child. Given all the evidence, Dr. Carter had drawn a chilling conclusion. In his opinion, Martin and the 7 other workers had a rare but often fatal lung disease called bronchiolitis obliterans, which literally meant the obliteration of the lungs' airways. Most people with this condition die within 5 years as their airways become increasingly inflamed and then scarred, making breathing extremely difficult. It can also cause the painful skin condition Martin was experiencing, although many doctors don't make the connection. And so while Martin and his co-workers were grateful to now have this information about what was happening to their bodies, at the same time, they were devastated. This condition they had was irreversible, and unless they got a lung transplant, they would die. In all of Dr. Carter's 25-year career, he'd only ever seen this disease 3 times. And now, there were 8 cases in a single town of only 1,000 people, and all 8 of those people worked at the same factory. Those were epidemic-level numbers. And so Dr. Carter picked up the phone and called the Missouri Department of Health and Human Services. 6 months later, in November of 2000, Dr. Rebecca Roberts stood on the factory floor at the popcorn plant, watching several factory workers breathe into small plastic devices called spirometers. Dr. Roberts had flown into Jasper the night before from Washington, D.C. She worked at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and this popcorn facility had been on her radar for a while now. Over the summer, Dr. Roberts and her team had learned about the 8 factory workers who had developed the terrible respiratory disease called bronchiolitis obliterans. She also knew that investigators from another agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, had inspected the popcorn facility. But the OSHA investigators didn't find any health or safety violations. But despite their findings, Dr. Roberts just couldn't get around the idea that there had to be some connection to this factory. I mean, the idea that 8 workers all at the same plant all developed the same rare lung disease, it couldn't be coincidence. So that August and September, she had personally conducted 2 walkthrough investigations of the popcorn plant. Now, during those visits, Dr. Roberts had not spotted any obvious red flags. But she still was not convinced that this factory was safe. So she had decided to return to the factory one more time, and this time she brought a medical team to do a more detailed survey. Today, her team was interviewing workers at the factory and using these spirometers to measure their breathing. While Dr. Roberts' team talked to workers on the main factory floor, she turned her attention to the mixing room, where Martin once worked. There was only one man in the mixing room, moving buckets of butter flavoring from one vat to another. When Dr. Roberts introduced herself, he shook her hand and said that his name was Simon. Then he began to cough into the crook of his elbow, and as he did, he kind of shook his head, cursing under his breath. Dr. Roberts asked him if he was coming down with something. Simon told her he'd had a cough for a while now. He laughed and said it actually helped him fit in, because pretty much everybody who worked in the mixing and packaging rooms had asthma or bronchitis or something like that, and so everybody was coughing all the time. After this short conversation, Dr. Roberts climbed up a nearby metal staircase to the mezzanine, which looked out over the mixing room. There were a few men working there, and she quickly waved them over. A tall guy with a hairnet came over first, and Dr. Roberts asked him if he had breathing problems too. The man nodded and said the doctors diagnosed him with asthma. He said he developed it over the past year, but for whatever reason, asthma medications did not seem to help at all. By the time Dr. Roberts left the factory an hour later, she had no doubt that there had to be a serious health problem at the Glister Mary Lee popcorn plant, and that it very likely started in the mixing room. But she still could not pinpoint exactly what the problem was. So she decided that investigators would need to visit the factory one more time. And this time, they'd take samples of everything. The popcorn, the flavoring mixtures, the cleaning products, and any hint of dust or mold. Whatever was in there making these workers sick, she was determined to find it. A few weeks later, inside of a lab, Dr. Roberts, along with 2 lab researchers, stared into a big plastic rodent cage full of rats that they were using in an experiment. Dr. Roberts and her team had tested all the samples they had collected from the popcorn plant. They'd identified 100 different potentially toxic compounds in those samples, but none of them seemed to be what was making people sick. Dr. Roberts had been very frustrated, but she did have one more idea. There was one more chemical that she wanted to test on the rats. This chemical was normally considered to be safe to eat, but there had been very little research done on what would happen if someone inhaled it. And sure enough, after the rats breathed in a large amount of the chemical, their breathing became shallow and labored. Later, when examined under a microscope, their lungs were revealed to be inflamed and scarred, just like human victims of bronchiolitis obliterans. Dr. Roberts finally had her answer. This seemingly innocent chemical was causing the disease plaguing Martin and the other workers. The test that Dr. Roberts and her team did proved that it was the delicious-smelling butter-flavoring mixture that was making the workers sick. Specifically, a chemical in the mixture called diacetyl. Diacetyl is a naturally occurring substance found in things like beer, butter, cheese, and coffee, and it can be used as artificial flavoring. No one suspected diacetyl because the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, had already determined it was safe to eat. But Dr. Roberts realized the FDA never tested whether diacetyl was safe to breathe, and it definitely was not. And the factory where Martin worked was using 3 times the diacetyl found in most butter flavorings at other factories. The deadly fumes wreaked havoc on employees' skin and lungs, creating irreversible damage. But Martin and his co-workers were not the only popcorn factory workers in danger. In October of 2001, there were 140 popcorn plants in the United States, and they were all using this butter mixture with dangerous levels of diacetyl. Even worse, there were thousands of other businesses that either made or used butter flavoring with diacetyl. That meant thousands of workers nationwide were at risk of developing what came to be called popcorn lung disease. In December of 2003, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health issued warnings to more than 4,000 businesses that either made or used this butter flavoring. In response, 80% of American popcorn makers stopped using diacetyl in their butter flavoring and switched to something else. Now, this made current and future workers much safer, but this did nothing to curb the damage that had already been done by the diacetyl poisoning. One of the workers at Martin's factory was awarded $20 million for the damage to his health, and part of that settlement was intended to go to the factory's other victims, including Martin Henry. However, the comfort from that settlement would be short-lived, because Martin would die on May 22, 2010. He was only 62 years old.
Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be Irish orphan Arthur Knight.
I'm not Nicholas Rossi.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas, the full story, and find out what happened next in Series 2, I Am Not Nicholas, The Trials. Across 3 brand new episodes, I'll take you inside the trials of Nicholas Rossi. We'll meet the women and detectives trying to bring him down, and the jurors who'll decide his fate. I even find myself being called to the witness stand.
I'm just concerned that I might come out with evidence that's not admissible, and if I do that, the trial collapses, all because of me.
That's I Am Not Nicholas, Series 1 and Series 2. You can binge all episodes early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts.
And now, here's our second story called Headache from Hell. In the late winter of 2023, 52-year-old Jacob Malloy stretched out in bed. He'd woken up late and was enjoying a lazy Sunday, petting his cat Gizmo, who was splayed out next to him on the bed. Finally, Jacob's stomach started to grumble, so he rolled out of bed and pulled back his curtains. A bright beam of sunshine filled his bedroom with light. He cracked open his window just enough to feel a cool but pleasant breeze sweep through his room. Jacob lived in Orlando, Florida, so even though it was February, it was a mild 60 degrees outside. Jacob heard the coffee maker percolating downstairs, and he knew that it was time to go join his wife Jessica for breakfast. So he went down to the kitchen and quickly invited Jessica to sit at the table while he made them both food. 30 minutes later, Jacob had bacon frying in a cast iron skillet on the stove while he poured pancake batter onto a searing hot griddle. After a minute, he flipped the pancakes, then he turned back to the stove to take the bacon out of the skillet. He timed it just right. The bacon was still soft and flopped gently onto his plate. He hated when bacon got too crispy. It tasted too dry. He used the grease from the bacon to fry up some hash browns and eggs, then carried 2 loaded plates over to the table. Jessica brought over the pot of coffee and then thanked her husband for the extravagant breakfast. Jacob winked and told Jessica not to tell his doctor. She laughed, but Jacob actually wasn't kidding. He was overweight and had type 2 diabetes, and so his doctor had told him a few times to lay off the greasy food. But Jacob figured what the doctor didn't know wouldn't hurt him. He dipped a forkful of hash browns into the golden yolk from his fried eggs and took a big, satisfying bite. A few weeks later, Jacob was out in the yard mowing the lawn when a sharp pain erupted in his temple. Jacob stopped the mower and beelined for the garage. He got migraines about once a month, so he knew what it felt like when one was coming on. Jacob called out to Jessica as he walked in through the garage door and jogged up the stairs. He got some headache medicine out of his nightstand and took 2 pills before collapsing onto his bed. Within a few minutes, a familiar ache began to pulse behind his temples. But instead of moving forward towards his forehead like usual, the pain seemed to migrate toward the back of his skull. And his migraine medication wasn't helping at all, which was unusual. It was strong stuff, and until now, it always seemed to do the trick. And so Jacob had no choice but to just bury his head in a pillow and ride out the pain. Finally, sometime that evening, the throbbing at the base of his skull subsided. It had been a shorter migraine, but so painful it didn't feel like he'd gotten off easy. 4 months later, Jacob sat in his primary care doctor's office, chatting with his physician while a nurse took his blood pressure. She frowned when she read the numbers aloud on the blood pressure sleeve. Jacob's doctor admitted they were a little high, but otherwise his vitals did seem fine. Jacob nodded. He expected a little bit of high blood pressure, given all the greasy food he'd been eating. But it was not high blood pressure that had brought Jacob to the doctor's that morning. It was his migraines. Ever since that day he was out mowing his lawn, they'd become more and more frequent. Weekly instead of monthly. And they were really beginning to interfere with his life. Most recently, he'd been spending just about every weekend laid up in bed. The doctor found this very concerning, and he asked if Jacob was experiencing any other symptoms, like seizures or numbness or sensations he couldn't explain. Jacob thought for a moment, but then said no, everything else felt normal. The doctor nodded and told Jacob that he wanted to order a CT scan. If there was something going on in Jacob's brain, the CT scan would show it. An hour later, Jacob and the doctor looked at the CT scan image of Jacob's brain on a computer screen. The doctor pointed to small circular areas in the middle of the scan, and he said that they looked like cysts within the white matter of Jacob's brain. Cysts are tiny fluid-filled sacs. The doctor said cysts in the brain are never good news because they can cause a painful pressure buildup and even vision problems. The doctor explained that his biggest concern amongst the cysts was the cluster of cysts located at the bottom right-hand corner of Jacob's brain. He thought that those could actually be causing Jacob's symptoms, the headaches. Jacob reflexively moved a hand and touched the base of his skull. He told the doctor that actually, now that he thought about it, there had been one change in his migraines besides their frequency. Instead of throbbing right above his eyes the way they normally did, the pain had sort of moved to the back of his skull, to right where that cluster of cysts was located on the CT scan. The doctor told Jacob he was admitting him to the hospital immediately. He suspected that Jacob might have a rare condition called congenital neurological cysts, meaning that these cysts have been present in his head for his entire life. But now they could be growing and pressing against Jacob's brain, causing these intense headaches. If more tests showed that was the case, Jacob would need brain surgery to remove the cysts and stop the pressure. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The thought of brain surgery terrified him. He asked if he could have a few minutes to call his wife and have her come down to the hospital. Later that afternoon, Jacob sat upright in a hospital bed, with Jessica sitting beside him in a chair. A neurologist stood at the foot of the bed, holding a new scan of Jacob's brain on his tablet. He explained that the location and distribution of the cysts in Jacob's brain were unusual. In his opinion, Jacob did not have congenital neurological cysts. Jacob perked up and asked if that meant he didn't need brain surgery. But the doctor said he wasn't sure yet. There was definitely still something in Jacob's brain that shouldn't have been there. Then he began asking Jacob questions about his travel history, whether he'd ever visited a farm and what his house and living conditions were like. Jacob felt mildly confused, but answered the doctor's questions as best as he could. Neither he nor Jessica traveled very much. The last time they left home was 2 years ago when they'd taken a cruise from Miami to the Bahamas, and he'd never been on a farm. The closest he got to animals was petting his cat, Gizmo. The neurologist asked Jacob to walk him through a normal day in his life, including everything he liked to eat at mealtimes. Jacob was a bit embarrassed, but he admitted to the lavish breakfast that he liked to make on the weekends. Jacob had barely started talking when the neurologist stopped him and told Jacob he'd be right back. Then he hurried out of the room. Jacob was a bit surprised, but it seemed like the doctor had a new idea, and soon enough, the neurologist was back. He informed Jacob that he was ordering a full workup to test for infectious diseases. Jacob nodded, feeling as curious as he was frightened. But the next day, the neurologist gave Jacob a diagnosis that he couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. The neurologist confirmed that Jacob did not have brain cysts, and Jacob felt instantly relieved by that. But the neurologist told Jacob to brace himself for the rest of the diagnosis. His migraines were being caused by foreign organisms that had somehow gotten into his brain. The round things that the doctor saw in his brain scan were living creatures, tapeworms to be precise. And the neurologist said they got there because of the fancy breakfast that Jacob loved so much. Specifically, it had to do with the bacon. Jacob didn't like crispy bacon. He liked soft, chewy bacon, something he told the doctor. But that indicated that the bacon was undercooked. And so the theory was, at some point, some of that undercooked bacon must have been infected with tapeworm larvae, and then those larvae were not killed in the frying pan. Had it been cooked long enough, they would have been. But even so, the neurologist explained that the tapeworms would never have reached Jacob's brain if not for a second problem. The neurologist said that the tapeworm can only infect the brain when someone touches the feces that contain the tapeworm larva. The neurologist suspected that after Jacob ate the tapeworm larva from the undercooked bacon, and then had a bowel movement containing the tapeworm larva, he must not have washed his hands properly and then touched his nose or mouth. After that, the larva made its way to Jacob's brain. Thankfully, the problem was treatable. The neurologist put Jacob on a 2-week regimen of antiparasitic and anti-inflammatory medications, which killed the tapeworms in his brain. Once the tapeworms were gone, his migraines improved. And so ultimately, Jacob learned a painful lesson in proper hygiene.